Now, where were we? Yes, Chapter 2. Roast Mutton. Up jumped Bilbo and put on his dressing gown and went into the dining room. There he saw nobody, but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe that the party of the night before had not been a part of his bad dreams. But as he rather hoped, indeed, he was really relieved after all to think that they had gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But with never a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help but feel a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron, lit the fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By the time the sun was shining, the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and forget about the night before. In fact, he was sitting down to a nice second breakfast in the dining room by an open window when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," he said, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you a message because they could not wait." "What message?" said poor Mr. Baggins, all afluster. "Great elephants!" said Gandalf. "You're not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "What's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do without washing up for 14. If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own note paper. This is what it read: "Thorn and Company to Burglar Bilbo, greetings. For your hospitalities and our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of your professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of the total profits, if any. All travel expenses guaranteed. In any event, funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives, if the occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make the requisite preparations, and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorn and Company." "That leaves you just 10 minutes. We will have to run," said Gandalf. Said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again, "no time for that either. Off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside, without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater, just on the stroke of 11, and found he had come without a pocket-handkerchief. "Bravo!" said Balin, who, standing at the inn door, looked out for him. Just then all the others came around the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of bags, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently, for Bilbo. "Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat, and I had left my pocket-handkerchief behind, and I haven't gotten any money, and I didn't get your note until after 10:45, to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket-handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get to the journey's end. As for your hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak, and my luggage. And that's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What would his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that, the party went along merrily as they told stories and sang songs, as they rode forward all day, except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that the adventures were not so bad after all. At first, they had passed through Hobbit lands, wide and respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads and an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely, and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by a wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had been obliged to camp where they could, but at least it had been dry. "To think it will soon be June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along with the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea-time, and it was pouring rain, and it had been all day, and his hood was dripping into his eyes, and his cloak was full of water. The pony was tired and stumbled on stones, and the others were too grumpy to talk, and I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes and into the food bags, thought Bilbo. Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing. It was not the last time that he wished that. Still the dwarfs jogged on, never turning round or taking notice to the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds, the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down to the bottom of a deep valley with a river at the bottom. The wind got up, and the willows along the bank bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with rains, came rushing down the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and the wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorn muttered something about supper. "And where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on?" Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. "Just when a wizard would have been most useful, too," groaned Dorian Norrie, who shared the hobbit's views about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided at the end that they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip, drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gone into the fire. Dwarfs can make a fire almost anywhere, out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took a fright at nothing and bolted. He got up into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out, Fili and Kili were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that it was carried was washed away off of him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper and less for breakfast. There they all sat glum and wet and muttering, while Oin and Gloin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that the adventures were not all pony rides in May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out in the dark mass of trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light that might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and others said yes. Some said they could but go and see, and anything was better than a little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all night. Others said, "These parts none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come out this way now. The old maps were no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the roads unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king around here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you're likely to find." Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where has Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, into the direction of the light. They came into the hill, and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or farm, and do what they could to make deal with the rustling and cracking and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go and find out about that light, and what it is, and if it's perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the Hobbit. "Now scuttle off, and come back quick, if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl, and once like a screech owl, and we'll do what we can." Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, any more than a fly like a bat. But at any rate, the hobbits can move quietly in the woods, absolutely quietly. They take pride in that. And Bilbo had sniffed more than once what he called all this dwarfish racket as they went along, and thought, "I don't suppose you and I could have noticed anything at all in the windy night, not if a whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off." As for Bilbo, walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for a fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking gravy off their fingers. There was a fine toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from the great heavy faces of them, and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey, if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough," said the second. "What the hell William was a-thinking to bring us to these parts at all beats me. And the drink running short, what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who took a long pull of his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said, as soon as he could. "You can't expect folks to stop here forever just to be et by you and Bert. You've et a village and a half between you since we've come down the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have thank you, Bill, for such a nice big fat valley mutton like this, what this is." He took a big bite from the sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that. Even those only with one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo thought he ought to have done something at once. Either he should go back quietly and warn his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand with a nasty mood, quite likely to try and roast a dwarf or even a pony for a change, or else he should have gone back and done a good, quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would, at this point, have picked the troll's pockets. It's nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it, and pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical, but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger in each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of many good things that he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted, and wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pocket seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind the tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up his courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. "Ha!" he thought, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. "This is a beginning." It was. The troll's purse are the mischief, and this was no exception. Who are you?" it squeaked, as it left the pocket, and William turned around and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind a tree. "Blimey, Bert, look what I copped," said William. "What is it?" said the other, coming up. "Lumme if I knows. What are yer?" "Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit," said poor Bilbo, shaking all over, and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. "A burra hobbit?" And they said several trolls are slow on the uptake, and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. "What's a burra hobbit got anything to do with my pocket, anyways?" said William. "And can you cook 'em?" said Tom. "Yer can try," said Bert, picking up a skewer. "He wouldn't make ye above a mouthful," said William, who had already had a fine supper. "Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there are more like 'em around, and we might make a pie," said Bert. "Here you, are there any more of your sort sneaking about these woods, and your nasty little rabbit?" he said as he looked at the hobbit's furry feet. And he picked him up by the toes and shook him. "Yes, lots," said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give any friends his way. "No, none at all. Not one," he said immediately afterwards. "What do you mean?" said Bert, holding him right way up, by the hair this time. "What I say," said Bilbo, gasping, "and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and I cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you. A perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if you only won't have me for supper." "Poor little blighter," said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had lots of beer. "Poor little blighter, let him go." "Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all," said Bert. "I don't want to have me throat cut in my sleep. Hold his toes by the fire until he talks." "I won't have it," said William. "I caught him anyway." "You're a fat fool, William," said Bert, "as I've said afore this evening. And you're a lout, and I won't have that talk from you, Bill Huggins," said Bert, and put his fist into William's eye. There was a gorgeous row, and Bilbo had enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs, calling at each other all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were all locked in another's arms, rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time that Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so he lay there for a while panting just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight came Balin. The dwarfs had heard the noise from the distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one, creeping towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light, he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarfs, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately. "A sack, Tom! Quick!" they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. The sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, or I'm mighty mistook. "Lots, and none at all it is," he said. "No burrow holes, but lots of these here dwarfs, and that's the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we'd best get out of the light." So they did. With sacks in their hands they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and gnawed mutton, and in surprise, pop, went a nasty-smelling sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Filly and Killy together, and Dory and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifer and Bofer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach him," said Tom, for Bifer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad as dwarfs will when cornered. Thorn came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell them that things weren't well. He stood outside the shadow some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo behind a tree. They had forgotten all about them. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" And he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out in the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught a hold of Tom's legs as well as he could with it was thick as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into some of the bushes, and Tom kicked the sparks into Thorn's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of his front ones. It made him howl, and I could tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorn's head and down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice little pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls, 2 of them with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine, or boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo in a bush with his clothes and skin torn, not daring to move, in fear that they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The troll had decided to roast the dwarfs now and eat them later, and that was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they all agreed to it. "No good roasting him now, it'll take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start an argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William. And so the argument began all over again, and in the end they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot, and they took out their knives. No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom. "Shut up," said they, "or we'll never have it done. And you can fetch the water yourself, if you say any more." "Shut yourself up," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know? You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom, and the argument began all over again, and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and boil them next time. "Who shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorn. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom. "But if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense. The one with the gray stockings," said a voice like William's. "I made sure it was yellow." "Yellow it was." "Then what did you say it was gray for?" said Bert. "I never did. Tom said it." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you." 2-1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you a-talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night's getting on and the dawn comes early. Let's get on with it." "Dawn take y'all and be stoned with you," said a voice that sounded like William's. But it wasn't. For just at that moment a light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke before he stood and turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds purchased them, for trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of mountains that they were made out of and never move again. And that's what had happened to Bert, Tom, and William. "Excellent," said Gandalf as he stepped out from behind the tree and helped Bilbo climb down from the thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until light came and made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed, and they had not at all enjoyed lying listening to the trolls making plans of roasting and squashing and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what happened to him twice over before they were satisfied. "Silly time to go practicing pinching and pocket picking," said Bomber, "when what we wanted was fire and food." "That's just what you wouldn't have got if those fellows without a struggle in any case," said Gandalf. "Anyhow, you are wasting time now. Don't you realize that trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere to hide from the sun in? We must go look into it." They searched about and soon found the markings of the troll's stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came upon a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it, not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. "Would this be any good?" asked Bilbo, when they were getting tired and angry. "I found it on the ground when the trolls had their fight." He held a largest key, though no doubt William had thought it was very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he turned to stone. "Why on earth didn't you mention that before?" they cried, and Gandalf grabbed it and fit it into the keyhole. The stone door swung back with a big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor and a nasty smell in the air, but there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves on the ground, and among the untidy plunder, all sorts of brass buttons to pots filled with gold coins standing in the corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I'm afraid they belonged to their victims, and among them were several swords of various makes and shapes and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because they were beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife on a leather sheath that would have only made a tiny pocket knife for a troll. but was good as a short sword for a hobbit. "These look like good blades," said the wizard, half drawing them, looking at them curiously. "They were not made by any troll, nor any smith among them in these parts in these days. But when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them." "Let's get out of this horrible smell," said Feely, and so they carried the pots of coins and such food as untouched and looked fit to eat, and also one barrel of ale, which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry, they did not turn their noses up at what they had got from the Troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty, and now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale and bacon to toast in the embers of the fire. After that they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more until the afternoon, when they brought their ponies and carried their pots of golds and buried them, very secretly, not far from the track of river, putting a great many spells over them in case they had the chance to come back and recover them. And when all that was done, they mounted once more and jogged along again on the path towards the east.